Hey everybody, it is demo time. What we're going to be going over here is the state and life cycle tutorial from the React group. So basically what I've got going on here is the work in progress 658 um, basic React app. So basically what I had here before was that long string of text. The background was hot pink. There was a form, if you recall. I've basically commented all of that out. So if you look at index.js here, we have these bootstrap lines. And I guess one other thing to note too, I moved over to VS Code. Just doing it in the terminal was getting really frustrating with the live reloading. So basically, I just have VS Code running here, and I've got a terminal running down here. This is still just Ubuntu 20. There is nothing, um, you know, technically it's the same. The only real difference is the text editor is now handled by Windows instead of the terminal. So I'm going to guess that's what's helping a bit here. So I could, in app here, I change this to 658 edition. I could also change this to let's do some state things, leave off the things. My 367 students got me using power mode to spice class up just for fun. So there's this lovely little counter here. Let's get rid of that very quickly because it's going to be probably annoying to all of you. Reload required. Perfect. Okay. Power mode disabled. And do we still have NPM running? NPM is still running. Good. Okay, so there's our thing changed. So what I'm going to do, honestly, is we are going to skip using app just for the purposes of this demo. I'm going to do everything in index.js here. Don't need this report web vitals. I'm going to comment out this bit here too. Now, this is not best practice. Hopefully that's self-evident. I should be doing everything in here in a separate components file, but just so that we can get moving along here, I'm going to just do it all in here. I'm going to leave it in place, just commented it out just for your benefit. So what we're going to do is the state and lifecycle demo, and goal really is I'm going to walk through each of these pieces, and it's not that long, honestly, but it's worth talking about. So I'm starting with this little bit here. So we want a ticking clock, and I'm just going to drop this right into my index.js. What's happening is that I've got an element, so I'm defining this div with the hello world and a ticking clock, and then I still have my call to react dom.render. And if you look at our commented code, this is basically the exact same thing here, except the difference is we'd be calling our app component instead of just this element that we're defining here. The other difference is that we have a set interval call. So this is, if you're not aware, effectively a callback timer type of situation where every 1000 milliseconds, the function tick is going to get called. So if you've ever done any animation, if you ever have needed a timer for anything, hopefully you've seen set interval, but if you haven't, basically handles it milliseconds. Every X milliseconds, call whatever the user passes in here, or the developer passes in. In this case, it's tick, where we define our element, and then we render it. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. We reload. Hey, look at that. We have a ticking clock, just like you had, hopefully, for one of your prior assignments, right? So we have that. Now, let's go ahead and turn it into something a little bit deeper. So this next bit is going to turn it into a component. Right now it's just a function. So we've got function tick. Let's go ahead and drop in our component clock. So again, we were passing in some properties for this thing. And what we'll be passing in is props.date.toLocale time string, which is the exact same thing you see down here. We're effectively just turning it into a component with some properties. So this clock object will be here. That's fine. Tick we still need, all right? But the difference is we're getting rid of that element, and now we're just going to render our clock component. And we're going to say date equals new date. Thank you, autocomplete. I'm going to be complaining about autocomplete quite a bit because I've got my VS Code set up for way too many things. Unity, Python, Perl, Ruby, and it just, I try to autocomplete and I don't ever turn it off because, yeah, why not? All right, everything else stays the same though. I do not have a new date. Thank you. Okay, React reloads. Exact same thing that we saw before, right? Life is good. Okay, so we turned a simple element into a component pretty seamlessly. And again, I would recommend doing these bits, like so going through these demos and doing it locally on your own machine rather than on CodePen, just so that you can kind of see how the entire framework fits together, right? That gets a little abstracted in CodePen. I could just as easily have defined that over here, say an app. Maybe I'd call this clock.js, function clock, export default clock, and then we should be fine there too. Okay, so we want to also have this timer be a little bit abstracted away as well, because right now we're passing it in every time we render here, and we don't want to do that. So let's go ahead and scroll down a bit, and what we're going to be doing next is turning this thing into an actual class, not just a simple component. So let's go ahead and rework this a bit. So class clock, uppercase, that was almost bad, extends react.component. Okay, so now I've got my function or my class, and I'm going to give it a render call. So basically, when I call render this component, this is what will happen. And I want to render out the exact same thing that we had before below. So we no longer need these function clock with props. Okay, so we have a render call. When this class gets rendered out, it's going to call this function. Touch of abstraction, but honestly, it's okay to have a little bit of that. All right, we need a semicolon there, and I feel like I'm missing. So okay, I'm missing the return. Need that, and that, and that. Semicolon was that. And hey, being in VS Code, we get some nice autocomplete, or nice code tidying as well. Okay, so we've got that guy now. We have a class. And let's go ahead and see if this is still working at this point. Props is not defined. That is fine. See what I'm missing in terms of my code, because I'm sure I forgot something. Props. What are we missing here? I'll be right back, 1 second. Again, too many languages bopping around my head. I forgot the this. Okay, silly me. So all that happened there, just a little typo from my part. We defined a class, we defined a render function for this class, and instead of what I had before is just this props.date, it's this.props now because that has to reference this actual class object. So this is basically internal to that class. Again, we're still kind of getting the exact same behavior, we're just making it a little bit more elegant and a little bit more self-contained. Okay, so we've got this now, life's good. All right, now we need local state. So instead of this.props, let's call this.state. And basically what we're going to do is take advantage of the state variable, which is delightful. And we're going to define that state as, okay, we need a constructor. So this is basically what happens when we initialize or instantiate this class. Okay. Hopefully this looks familiar from the little JavaScript CS6 demo I did where we had a class and then a constructor. Whenever you call let something equals new, whatever your class is called, the constructor gets called when you call that new bit. All right, so we want to super props because that's going to pass our properties up to the React component level and instantiate that. And we want to define a variable state, date, new date, data. It's just date. Okay, so this is what happens when we instantiate a new clock. Render is going to be the same, except this.state.date. Okay, that is good. This bit should still be mostly fine. Again, I would recommend, I'm skipping through this because, yeah, again, I know what this is doing, and I'm hoping to just communicate the main bits here, but there's a lot of little nuances that's worth picking up as well. Okay, other thing. So when we call this.state equals date, new date, we can get rid of this down here. All right, so this is now just a clock because we are creating that date object inside of our class, not in the element. So basically, point is we took the clock, the current date definition, moved it inside this class. When we refresh, we actually, oh no, it's static. It's no longer updating. Whatever shall we do? Well, we need to call tick. So tick is being called. Now we need to basically make the clock update itself, which makes sense. It's not happening down here anymore. And what this is going to do is actually involve mounting, which is right here. This is called mounting. Basically what's happening is that we render or we create the clock element, we instantiate it, now we need it to take care of itself. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so we have some extra calls to make in here. Component did mount, and this is an empty function for now. And then component will unmount. Okay, so we have those now. And in our check to see if it was mounted, this.timer ID equals set interval. So here we're setting up our timer. That gets a semicolon here. And hopefully this looks familiar at this point. Got an arrow function being defined. So we are creating a timer, and we're going to call it this.timer ID. It's going to be internal to this class object. We're going to call set interval. Again, this is going to be recurringly called every 1000 milliseconds. And the first parameter now is not calling the clock update function. We are calling this.tick, which we're going to have to define tick inside of here. Okay, so once we unmount this thing, we need to clear or clean up ourselves. So let's clear interval, this.timer ID. Okay. So add our timer, clear our timer once it unmounts, and now we need to add tick. So hopefully, you know what you're looking for here. We're going to define a function called tick inside of our class. And lo and behold, it's just grabbing the current date, which is going to be that entire timestamp. So this.set state, date, new date, and semicolon. All right. So we no longer need this tick down here as well. I probably needed to get rid of that earlier. Now, save, refresh. Well, don't even need to refresh. Time's happening. So I ran through that super fast. Let me kind of explain what happened here. So before we had a timer calling the tick function every 1 second, and it was perfectly fine. Okay, we want to turn this into a component. Okay, well, we can do that, but then things start getting a little bit mucky if we wanted to have, say, multiple clocks, or if we want to nicely separate our concerns out, or have it play nicely with our class or our component hierarchy. So we turned our clock into a class. All right, so this is still just a JavaScript ES6 class. We're going to have it extend React.component, meaning that it's inheriting everything component related in React. So this is going to be a clock that is a React component. Hopefully that was self-evident. The constructor is what we call to initialize everything. We have to call super so that this component also gets initialized. We're going to define a variable called state, which is our current date. All right. Once it is mounted, we're going to kick off our timer. So basically, once things are loaded in and set up, we're going to kick off our timer. When it unloads, we're going to get rid of that timer so that it stops. Obviously here, that's not going to do anything. We define this tick function, where this is just getting the updated time. That gets called every 1 second. I could update this to be even faster if I wanted, so let's change this to 500 milliseconds. And it's going to run a touch faster. Obviously, this is not real time anymore. Could change it to be a lot slower. I mean, it still catches the right time, which is good. But 1 second is good. All right, so tick, it works. Render is going to be what we dump onto the page, which is, again, just this JSX style element. And we are getting this.state.date. So this.state. And inside of state, we have a attribute called date, which is stored in the timestamp format, and we will convert it to a nice string. You could format this however you want, right? This is just a nice little helper function. We got rid of the timer down here, and we are just calling render on this clock element. And every time render gets called, we're going to return, well, we're going to return this, and then we're going to get a nice timer-based update. So that JavaScript front end updating itself, basically. Hopefully that makes sense. And then we have a nice little recap here, which I just kind of talked about. One thing that we didn't really mention, or that I didn't mention, is that I've got this cheeky little, where is it at? Set state call. All right, so what this is doing is we are nicely updating our variable. So the idea is that we want to have an abstracted out way of updating class variables in here. I could just say this.date equals bleh, but that kind of breaks our don't update your properties pattern that we're trying to follow. So don't do this, do this, okay? And out of curiosity, I'm just gonna check to see, because I'm curious, because on CodePen it perfectly let me do it. And I don't remember offhand, and I find that if I do things and they break, you will see what not to do, right? So this.date equals new date, and I'm literally just curious to see. Do we get an error? We do not get an error, but it doesn't update. Okay, so if we do that, I was just kind of curious to see if we got like a legitimate error message. So it breaks, but it doesn't break like to the point where you would notice it without really digging into it. Okay, so we have a state being set, and let's see, what else do we want to add in? We're not doing any of this stuff. Data flows down. Okay. All right, that's probably enough. I just kind of wanted to free code this demo for y'all to show you what I would do. I'm skipping over things because I'm not going to be implementing them here. But if you wanted to, I would definitely recommend like going through each of these to make sure that you're clear on what's happening. So let's, just for funsies, let's define a new class. So let's call this function, let's call it stacked clock maybe. And I want to return, I'm basically just following this little app example you see there. I want to return a div. Okay. And I want to return, let's do, 3 clocks seems fine. Do 3. And I want to drop that in my render function. So this is now a stacked clock. I should see, yep, there's my 3 times. And what I can even do now is let's add in a size equals 1. So I'm going to add in basically a line break bar type of thing. HR, my favorite element for minimal web design. So there you go, 3 clocks right on top of each other. I could be cute and give one a class, another a different class, and yeah. But basically, idea here is just play with this one, get a good feeling for how data flows and how to transform something that you code up pretty, trivially by hand and turn it into a class. Because again, this becomes a lot more extensible and a lot better in a lot of ways. Anyway, we'll see you in the next one. Bye, everybody.